And now I would like to share with you the webinar series. So this is our, can you see it? Yeah. So we'll start today with Jochen, which is a real pleasure to have you here. I will present you in a few minutes. But then we had during January, we have Christoph Flöckiger with assessing and working with human strength in clinical settings. Are the signals positive or just noise? Then in February, we have Marcus Wolf with the title Digital Mental Health, Hype, Hope, and the Real World. The fourth will be with Dana Slonin Atzil, Dynamic Dyadic Process in Psychotherapy in April. And the last one will be Aren Bar Khalifa, Interpersonal Emotional Regulation Processes in Couples Therapy. So I think this is a very nice program, and I really hope to have you here in the next webinars. We'll send the links for the registration pretty soon for the next one, so please be attentive to that. And now I would like to briefly present Jochen and thank him for being here. Just 1 minute, please. Okay, so Jochen Wilson, and I believe I assassinated your last name, which is really difficult to say in Dutch, which I believe it's the right pronunciation. I even searched in Google, but I am unable to do it, so please forgive me. He's Associate Professor of Clinical Psychology at Université Catholique de Leuven, Belgium. He's a coordinator of the Leuven Psychotherapy Research Group, and he practices as a psychoanalytic therapist. His research focus are on clinical reasoning and case conceptualization in psychoanalytic psychotherapy. And I would like to add three brief important things. He has been involved in several case study research projects and PhD dissertations using case study methodology, and he's also published on case study methodology. The second topic is that in 2018, he was awarded the Best Evidence-Based Psychoanalytic Case Study Prize by the Association for Psychoanalytic Psychotherapy, and is one of the founding members of the Single Case Archive, a large online archive of published case studies. And the third, which is a project for the future, is that in October 2023, he led the submission of an application, a cost action, for the creation of an European network of case study researchers in the field of psychotherapy. And if this application is successful, this network will receive European funding to organize a series of network activities over the period of 4 years, from 2024 to 2038. And these activities will be meetings of experts, workshop, training events, and conferences. And the network consists of 41 colleagues. I have the privilege of being one of those, from 19 different European countries. And the results of the evaluation, which fingers crossed will be positive, it will be published in June 2024. And if this application is successful, this will be an open network. So you are invited to contact Jochen to discuss possible future collaborations if you are interested in. So after this brief presentation, once again, my apologies for the delay, and Jochen, the virtual floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Miguel, for that kind introduction. And good evening to everyone. Yes, so I will be talking about case study research based on my own experiences with the methodology. I have prepared a series of slides. Can I share those slides via Zoom? I think I should be able to do so. So I think now you can see my slides. Yeah. Okay. Just is that in presenters mode or
We can see the sidebar, so it's not in presenting mode. You
and
need,
if
yes,
I
you need to press there.
do this, it still works?
That's okay now, perfect.
Yeah, okay. So maybe I can tell a few words about the context in which I currently work. So I have created the Louvain Psychotherapy Research Group 3-4 years ago at UC Louvain, which now consists of two professors, me and Emmanuel Zick, he's my colleague. And then we have 4 doctoral students, occasional research interns, and then the students who are involved in various research projects as part of their master dissertation. But our works are really focused on 2 axes, research axes. So the first one is psychotherapy process research, and case study research figures in this axis actually. And we're involved in a series of case study projects. The second research axis is somewhat differently. It's about psychotherapist training and professional development also, although the case study methodology occasionally also comes in that research axis. We have a website and you can see that it's located in the French-speaking part of Belgium. So there's actually the Flemish-speaking university, Louvain or Leuven, and then the French-speaking, which is the new Louvain, Louvain-la-Neuve. We also have a research clinic where we are starting to do research on our own patients, actually. And in this research clinic, we offer person-centered therapy and psychoanalytic psychotherapy. So that's a bit a context for my current research activities. Now, today I will be talking to you about case studies, why one could do case study research, what are the reasons to do it, or what are the reasons I do it. I'll tell you more about the basic principles of case study research, because case study research is a very flexible way of studying certain phenomena, and there are different ways to do it. And I won't be covering all the different approaches in case study research, but I'll mention the basic principles, and then finally I will talk about specific approaches, or I will lay out a specific methodology to do it, which is one amongst many. But in the end, I'll give you some more references, key references on case study research. So why do I do case study research? I didn't start off as a case study researcher. I started in the more traditional sense of doing quantitative analysis, statistical analysis on forensic topics. Psychopathy was actually the topic of my PhD. And but already during my PhD, I was confronted with the, let's say, many limitations of doing big sample statistical studies. And I wanted to get to grips, let's say, get into detail of what this phenomena, in this case psychopathy, was about. And as part of my PhD, I did a first case study on psychopathy in a woman. So it was more a forensic case study. But then this later evolved in particular during my postdoc towards focusing on case study research full time, because I noted this allows to study complexity. In the literature, some people make a distinction between case-based approaches in research and variable-based approaches. Me and a PhD student a few years ago wrote a paper about different, let's say, epistemic approaches to studying phenomena, and how case studies offer a whole, not just methodology, but a whole epistemology also to think about phenomena, to think about a phenomena on a case-based, or in terms of cases, let's say. And if we then focus specifically on psychotherapy, psychotherapy is, everybody knows what, if you study the phenomena of or you experience it yourself, it is multifaceted, it is complex, and it is ambiguous. Ambiguous in the sense that events, results, processes are open for multiple interpretations. I mean, if we talk about good outcome, for instance, successful therapy, even a seemingly obvious outcome like the disappearance of depression, in quantitative terms, can be interpreted in different ways. If one asks the patient themselves how they experience the outcome of the therapy, it might not be so, let's say, clear as is suggested by quantitative data. So in order to go into depth and to the levels of meaning, it is best to focus on a case study. Case studies also allow to study psychotherapy process within the context in which they emerge. And this context is, of course, at least the person of the patient, the person of the therapist, and their relationship. So this is already 3 elements which constitute a certain context. But then there's also everything that happens outside of the therapy room, and that also plays a role. For instance, a child who is in psychotherapy, who receives the support from their parent. The parental support is something happening outside of the therapy, but of course has a major influence on the therapeutic process. So in order to take into account this extra therapeutical factor, one needs to look at the context. If another patient, for instance, at a certain point between sessions commits a suicide attempt, this suicide attempt is not just, it cannot be glossed over. It is part of the therapeutic process and needs to be taken into account to understand the outcome or to understand the therapy process. And so the border between the process and the context is not always clear. Sometimes it is more easy to identify, let's say, elements that are outside and don't have an influence. But in many cases, it is more difficult, and that is what let's say case studies allow to do. A simple quantitative aggregating many subjects in a sample would kind of leave out all those very interesting, relevant events and factors and influences in the process. It allows, the second reason for me is that case studies allow to study causality. Causality usually is described or studied through experimental designs. But actually, in a case study, one can look at change processes. And change processes or research that focuses on change processes is about identifying, describing, explaining, predicting the effects of the processes that bring about therapeutic change. So this type of research is about linking specific patient and therapist interaction, about what happens in a session, let's say, to in-session outcomes, a certain reaction in the patient, a certain insight, a certain way of relating or experiencing, that are then related to intermediate between session outcomes. So, for instance, an improvement at the level of functioning or symptomatological level, which is then on the longer term related to a final outcome, a successful outcome, for instance, of a therapy. So the type of causality questions that are related, that are addressed through case study research are not about, let's say, regularities, statistical regularities and probabilities, but about the question, how do certain effects are produced? And I would like to refer in this context to very interesting paper that was published in the most recent issue of Psychotherapy Research, where exactly this, let's say, alternative notion of causality, in contrast to, let's say, the notion of causality that is used in experimental research, this alternative notion is put forward and developed, and they explicitly refer to case study research as one way to study causality, actually. So to illustrate this a bit with this figure, one can look at effects or processes between sessions towards a final outcome, but one can also look at processes within specific sessions by isolating, for instance, particularly interesting moments of specific types of interventions, allowing one to see how the therapist reacts to the patient, and the patient then reacts to the therapist, and how this interaction develops over time. So this would be a kind of a mechanism of change, gaining insight. And this is a figure that I take from one of the studies that I'm working on, in which we are particularly interested in how defense and transference interpretations are taken up by the patients. And so we look at the overall process and the outcome, but we also look at sequences in which core conflicts, core issues of the patients are worked on. And then we see how this interaction between patient and therapist happens and can then be linked to a broader process of therapeutic change, in this case, of gaining insight. A final reason to look at case studies and to do case study research is that fact that it generates practical knowledge. So very often it is conducted in case studies are conducted in naturalistic settings, which gives them a particular relevance for clinicians. They often start from questions with a practical relevance also, and they generate knowledge that is relevant for psychotherapists. So something which is often called practice-based evidence. And so in that sense, it's logical. It's not surprising to see that many clinicians like to read case studies because it speaks to them. It's the language they understand. It's the type of knowledge they can relate to their clinical work. And it helps them to bridge this gap between practice and between research and practice. Now, I must also add that case studies are not only about practical knowledge. There are also ways to do fundamental research with case studies, which is then a theory building approach, in which a case study is actually used as a test for a certain model, or as a means to develop a new model, or to modify, amend a certain model, or to test a model in new populations or new types of treatments, etc. So so these are, for me, the main reasons to do case study research, and the basic principles that I adhere to are, let's say, about 4 basic principles that I think are general to that are applicable to case study research in general. Despite all the variations, let's say. A first principle is that one always needs to define the case. Let's say a case is can be an individual. It can be an individual doing therapy. Well, that's the process we're talking about. But of course, this individual or this case is not only about this one individual. It's also about the therapist and then their interaction. So this already makes it a bit more complex of the question what we're talking about. It's not just something that happens within the patient or within the interaction between the therapist and the patient. It's something that involves all of those. So it's very important to think carefully about what the case is a case of, let's say. And this is not just a diagnostical question. It can be a diagnostical question, and for which then diagnostical tests and case formulation are very important. But it can also be a question of determining what one will focus on in the in the case, and how one can understand what the phenomena that is observable in the case, let's say, because a case offers a lot of material, and how will one select in that material? How will one delineate, let's say, the points of interest? If a case is said, let's say, if we're interested in looking at a failed case, a case of a failed treatment, does that mean that we are looking at, let's say, a patient who, for some reason, fails to pick up or engage with the treatment process and benefit from it fully? Or is it more a case of a failed intervention, a clinician who doesn't succeed in applying properly applying the intervention? Or is it a bit of both? And then what will we focus on? So what is the case a case of? Is a crucial question, which is of course very important to address first while developing a research question. And the research question will already define and delineate in a certain way what the case is about. And then the role of theory is also important in that regard. I mean, theory offers us some templates, some concepts to understand what a case is about. With which we then obviously have to be careful that it doesn't obfuscate or make us blind for what is not mentioned in the theory, etc. So the second basic principle is about creating a rich data set. So case studies will always include some element of time series data, because case studies allow to study processes over time. So one will repeatedly present certain measures, certain questionnaires, or collect some data along the way. And this is also one of the major benefits of doing case study research, that one can see how things or certain phenomena unfold over time. And one is able to track changes over time very closely to, let's say, the patient or the interactions between patient and therapist, and then to describe that change process or to test a certain hypothesis about what is evolving. These time series data can be collected for the case as a whole. I mean, it can start before the start of treatment. One can start with an interview, for instance, and then collect some type of data throughout the process. And then at the end, after completion of the treatment, one can repeat certain types of data collection to finish off or to come to kind of a conclusion about the whole process. But it can also be applied at the micro level. For instance, because one might be interested in specific types of interventions, or maybe one wants to make a case study about one particular session, that's perfectly possible. An opening session or another type of session and then having the possibility of collecting data or time series data of specific interactions, for instance, at the level of the session is very interesting and crucial. It's one of the basic principles. Another element of this rich data set is typically the use of mixed methods. So good case studies can make a convincing case for a certain process. In order to be able to do so, one needs some qualitative data, which will facilitate the interpretation of what's happening, which will facilitate the inclusion of different, let's say, in-depth meaning-making processes of what happens. But then also some quantitative data that have the benefit of, producing numbers, which have a certain value, let's say, objectifying, let's say, quantifying certain processes, which are also much more easy to present later on in the manuscript. Qualitative data are difficult to present or take up more place, let's say. So they are very complementary, and one needs to think about the relation between the quantitative and qualitative data, and they can inform each other in different way. Certain types of case studies will put more of an emphasis on, for instance, the quantitative data, in which one tracks, for instance, behavioral change, very concrete, observable behavioral change over time, while other case studies will put more emphasis on the qualitative data, for instance, more clinical case studies produced by a clinician. But it's good to have both, and to think about how one is going to think about their relation, and also possibly about, let's say, the differences, the divergences that emerge between these different types of data, or within each type of data, because qualitative data and quantitative, they don't necessarily corroborate each other. I already gave the example, I think, of a failed case study. It's actually a case study that I'm working on. A failed case study of a patient who let's say does not improve, a depressed patient who does not improve at the end of the treatment. But when the researchers go and interview the patient herself, actually what she says about the treatment are very positive things. She says how it has helped her to make some changes in her life, which actually are very meaningful to her. And the depression is still there, but the depression, let's say, is also something, it has shifted meaning. While it is something she now kind of lives with, and even allows her to let's say, relate to other people who are also depressed, as part of a network of mental health users. So the meaning of, let's say, a quantitative measure, the degree of something or the frequency of a certain behavior, does not necessarily express or correspond to a certain meaning of that number. Hence the importance of collecting both types of data. The importance of teamwork. Case studies, as I said, they address complexity, and in order to untangle part of this complexity, it is necessary to return iteratively or repeatedly to the same data, and also to do it with several people who can offer different perspectives, ideally with some people with or various levels of experience, but let's say low levels of clinical or research experience, maybe has also the benefit of, let's say, coming with a fresh perspective, different commitments in the field, and I think I always find it very interesting to collaborate with undergraduate or graduate students on case studies, to have their kind of naive perspective on it, and then combine that with more an expert view. So triangulation of the data analysis, inclusion of the clinician, both in the research design So very early on, it's important. What is feasible in terms of data collection? What are patients willing or able to do in terms of they participating in data collection? But then also later on in the clinical interpretation of the findings, involving them or having them read the final paper to see whether they can agree with the interpretations and the conclusions that one makes. So that's definitely a useful thing to do. Also a question about the use of the clinician and the researcher's subjectivity. That's something that is maybe thought about differently in different approaches, but in the psychoanalytic approach, it's definitely worthwhile and actually very important to think about the countertransference and everything that the clinical material not only, let's say, evokes in the clinician during clinical work, but also in the researcher, and yeah, let's say the emotional states and the kind of experience that it evokes, as also being part of the process and also being a source of information that somewhere figures in the whole, let's say, contributes to the whole. A fourth basic important principle is ethics, of course, because case study research is really kind of triggers a conflict of values. Because on the one hand, there is the importance of improving psychotherapy and improving interventions and doing researches is kind of has on the longer term for other patients and other therapists a great importance. But on the other hand, of course, for this individual patient, this particular patient, it's important that his or her privacy and integrity are protected. So how to balance this? Nowadays, most journals ask patient consent, and I would agree that this is an important part of the ethical reflection that needs to be had. But I also find it a bit an easy solution, because asking the patient to consent is a bit of a legalistic approach. In my opinion, it doesn't absolve the researcher from using his own, let's say, sense of responsibility to really protect the privacy and integrity of the patient. Because even if the patient uses or gives his consent, does he or she fully know what she's giving consent to? I mean, they might not know what actually a case study looks like, what the final case study will look like. They might give consent in the beginning of treatment and not know what the treatment will bring up. So it's not sure what kind of material there will be used in the case study. So and at the end too, giving consent at the end too has the limitation of what will the research actually do with the case study. So to me, it's just only a partial solution. I would suggest a range of possible, let's say, measures that a researcher can take. And first one is, of course, to refer to the deontological code of the profession. As a psychotherapist, psychologist, there are certain, let's say, principles to respect. And it comes down to the individual researcher to respect those. The second step would be institutional review board, so submitting it to an ethics committee and getting their approval, which especially for researchers affiliated with universities or hospitals, it will be a necessary step. For researchers who are doing case study research on their own time, let's say, they will not have this institutional review board, and they will have to rely on their deontological code, let's say, to do their study. Then, of course, use disguise, leave out certain information, change information, but this also comes with limitations, pros and cons. So occasionally I hear about case study researchers who change the the sex of a patient and to describe, but I mean, to me that changes the whole case study in itself. But I think other elements can be changed. The details like the age or the number of family siblings, for instance, etc. Then there's the patient consent that I already mentioned. There's the possibility of having the patient approve the final case reports, which again has pros and cons. There are examples in the literature of patients who have done this, or authors who have done this, but I think the major risk would be that it alters the meaning of the therapy for the patient. As I said, therapy is a complex, ambiguous, multifaceted process. If a patient then reads his own case study, it might, shed a whole new light that might not be productive. And the therapy has come to a closure. So where does that leave the patient? So pros and cons. A good alternative is, I think, to ask a colleague to read the case and to act as an advocate. The author might be a bit, the research team might be a bit biased towards trying to publish, or kind of that's what they're, what they want, of course. So ask a colleague to might offer an alternative to that. And then in the end, to me, it's also very much about taking moral responsibility for what one is doing. And this means during the design stage, establishing a serious research methodology, the execution of the research, I mean, doing it seriously, and then also the writing up in the phrasing and the words one uses to describe a patient and their suffering and their life experiences. There are a whole difference can be made, which is also an ethical difference of conveying, let's say, giving voice to the patient, also in the case study. So these are some reflections on that. Shall we take questions at the end? Yeah, then I'll first continue.
Yes, I think it's better.
Yeah, okay. Then I'll move to the part of, let's say, how to do it. How to do a systematic case study. I already mentioned that there are endless ways to do it, and that's one of the nice parts of the creative work of developing a methodology is very nice. But it can also be quite time consuming, and one can lose a lot of time while planning how to do it. So here is a suggestion of how to do it with some steps, which are still fairly general. So to do a case study on a research, a therapy process. So one way to start, I think always for any research project, is starting with a research question. And for a case study project, this would typically be a how or why question. I refer here to a quote by Yin, which is a social science researcher, very interesting author on case studies in the social sciences, who says that whereas experimental or quasi-experimental studies, and he's talking about evaluation studies, will assess effectiveness by determining the strength of a relationship between an initiative and its, so an intervention and its outcome. The case study will offer an explanation of the relationship, indicating how the initiative, so the intervention, actually worked or not to produce a certain outcome. So a how or a why question, which can then obviously evolve during, as with qualitative research in general, case studies, the question is not set, let's say, in stone with a hypothesis or by the specific hypothesis. It can be in certain types of case studies, but usually it is refined along the way. For instance, because one discovers that actually one started off with a an idea about what this case was about, and then finds that it's actually about something different. And that's much more interesting to focus on that aspect of the case study. Some examples of case research questions is how does a racial difference between therapist and patient involve the or influence the treatment process in psychodynamic psychotherapy? Or how do the patients experiencing and the therapist, or sorry, the therapeutic relationship contribute to the success of therapy? So it's about here a specific process of experiencing, and then the relationship that is the focus. Or final one is not really a question, but still defines what it's about. The degree to which, in this case, child psychotherapy was able to modify the existing state of mind of the traumatized patient, especially in terms of developing a capacity for reflection. Well, some examples. So a research question, and then a theory of change. Case studies, because they involve a lot of data about a single individual and a complex process, it is useful to, let's say, have a theory that allows one to, let's say, relate certain observations to each other, or to focus on certain aspects of the process and not on others. So each therapeutic approach has a theory of change. And at the same time, there are, let's say, integrative or trans-theoretical models too about processes that are relevant. So as a researcher, one works from from a specific perspective. One makes a choice, of course, in it for the theory of change, which will then determine, of course, the design of the case study. For instance, what type of variables will we focus on, or what aspect of the process will we focus on? To what degree is the case formulation or the diagnosis relevant, etc., etc. So therapy helps to select a relevant case study, and also to select relevant material within the case study. And then theory is also important for drawing conclusions on the basis of the case study, because by having a theory and comparing it with the case, one can then go back to the theory and arrive at some more general conclusions. And because case studies, of course, are about one single individual, not about a population or a sample or a population. But case studies allow to, ideally, allow to say something about a theory. And in that sense, they allow to come to a more general conclusion, to generalize towards a theoretical proposition. So in that sense, theory is it's very important. And there's a question of case selection, where one selects a case on the basis of the research question. So certain types of cases are, the case should speak to a certain question, of course. And it is, rather than selecting the case randomly, it is better to purposefully select a case study in which a certain phenomena, be it, for instance, a complex therapeutic relationship or breakdown or rupture and repair. If you have a case study, if you select a case study at random, you might find a case study in which this process goes very smooth, and then it's not informative. It would be much more interesting to study a case in which there is a particular breakdown or challenges. So purposefully select a case and also explain that in the paper itself. And because it is allowed, let's say, it makes sense to purposefully select a case rather than randomly, but it's also important to explain that in the paper. So this is not considered a form of bias for the case study research. No, this is a condition to study a certain phenomenon. it must be present, and it must be present in an interesting way. Also, make sure that you have plenty of data for the case study, for the case. So maybe you might work on data that have already been collected, and then select the case study for which you have complete or almost complete data. And that will, that's also one of the benefits that you can, let's say, leave out the partial data from the start, or cases with partial data. So then in terms of data, maybe the data have been collected as part of another project, RCT. Maybe you will start new data collection, but let's say step 4, we look at the data, in which you then, as I mentioned, go for a mix of quantitative and qualitative data. Qualitative data can be process notes, so small, preferably semi-structured notes taken by a therapist at the end of each session. These kind of process notes will help you to get a quick access and to the therapy process from the perspective of the therapist. So actually it's a double benefit. You have quick access, summaries of hours and hours of therapy, and you also have the therapist's reflection on this process, because he or she will write about it in therapist notes. Then the recording and the transcription of sessions. For the transcription, there are certain guidelines published by Mergenthaler, which are frequently used. Either one transcribes whole therapies or whole sessions or parts of sessions, that depending on the funding and time one has. Ideally, one also has a semi-structured or clinical interview with the patient and the therapist, maybe at the beginning of the treatment, about expectations, how they the patient find their way, why they contact the therapist, what they would like to work on during the treatment, for instance. And then at the end of the treatment, to look back on the process. Having these kinds of data from the patient and from the therapist will help to focus on particularly interesting sessions or parts of sessions. Because one of the risks of case studies is that you have an overwhelming amount of data, and how to select the relevant parts within a certain time frame also. Having this patient interview and therapist interview at the end, in which questions are asked about how did the treatment help you? What did the therapist do to help you deal with your problems or something? Often they will be able to remember certain specific moments or aspects of the process and help you to select those. And also provides a clear rationale why you select certain sessions or certain processes within the treatments. Some might use a patient journal. Some might use products, let's say, during the treatment, pictures, drawings taken, for instance, for child psychotherapy, but also in adult psychotherapy. A colleague in my research group presented data in which he had an adult patient express himself to drawings at several occasions, and one could see in the drawings actually a transformation taking place. Then quantitative data, so we have, there's patient and therapist self-report, of course, observation measures. These can be very structured. There's an enormous number of measures that can be used, process and outcome measures. Depending, of course, on the theory and the model of change one uses, one can better choose certain questionnaires and observation measures. And all of that together then offers you a multi-level perspective. I mean, at the level of individual sessions, and so micro level, and at the level of the whole therapy, macro level, and also multiple perspectives. You have the patient giving information, the therapist giving information, an observer, a researcher, who's making quantifying certain elements, etc. So a bit about the data analysis. I generally find it useful to get a first start by getting a grasp of the whole process, for instance, on the therapy notes, or by listening to the final recording of the interview, or by listening to the start, the first session too. Is always very interesting to get a first idea of what the case is about and what's happening. Having clinical experience helps with that, of course, or one might ask the help from a clinician. But it's also possible to use more systematic qualitative methodologies to kind of organize the material. Quite a few case studies use thematic analysis to, for instance, code all episodes in which a person talks about a certain issue, or in which the therapeutic relation is at stake or is discussed by the therapist and the patient, for instance. And they use that. For quantitative measures, it's interesting to plot and to do some visual analysis. I'll give an example of that. Then to select relevant parts of the treatment or parts of sessions to then quantitatively and qualitatively study. So it's a matter of starting broad and then honing in on certain processes or events, which could be called significant events, change events, tipping points, and there are different terms being used in the literature. So the post-treatment interview, I already mentioned that. And yeah, it's interesting to keep in mind that the most relevant information can arise in the most different part of the data set. So it can be something that is discussed, for instance, in a case study. The patient actually talks quite a bit about what's happening outside of the sessions and how she's doing outside of the sessions. And actually, these elements of the narrative, let's say, are very informative to understand the whole process of also what's happening within the treatment. So don't let's say be blind, be open to be, let's say, surprised, and to include these pieces of information that put all the rest into a new perspective. Here's an example from a case study. It's a case study, a systematic case study of the treatment of a sex offender who was institutionalized and during almost 2 years. And so he went we went through different phases of the treatment, and what you can see in this figure is here on the x-axis the timeline, and in terms of weeks. So you can see that it's a long period of time, and on the y-axis there is the self-report measure for emotion regulation. And in phase A, while he was still in prison, you can see that his emotion regulation was very negative, dysregulated, which is more or less what we expected. Then during phase B, he was included in the treatment facility. He entered the treatment facility and went through a CBT treatment. And you see there that there's counter to our expectations, actually, the emotion regulation already started to improve during this phase of cognitive behavioral treatment. Phase C was the phase in which he received emotion-focused therapy. And actually, we had expected to see most of the change during this period. But you can see that rather instead, he went through some fluctuations in his emotion regulation. Now this goes over weeks and weeks. So, and And towards the end, there was week 146, for instance, there was a violent incident in which he was as a witness involved within the institution. You see that his emotion regulation peaks or dysregulation peaks at that moment. But actually that event was very instrumental then for his final kind of balance, him tipping over towards improving again his emotion dysregulation. And during the follow-up, again, phase A, outside of the treatment facility in the community, this the therapeutic improvement was confirmed actually, also with other measures. So this is kind of a visual analysis of one example of how it can be done. This is another example. Maybe just point out that in you see more or less of the same process, although in the switch from, let's say, prison first phase A to the treatment facility phase B actually led to a leap in terms of affect dysregulation in this person, which then through the therapy was improved. In the emotion focus therapy was further consolidated, let's say, and was confirmed during the follow-up weeks and months later. This is another example. This is a different, this is a psychoanalytic treatment of a person with dissociative identity disorder, which me and colleagues from Ghent University wrote a case study. And one can see that yeah, there was the outcome measure or the process measure. He was interpersonal behavior dysregulated, let's say, in the start of treatment, and then went to an improvement, rapid improvement, kind of a stable, more or less stable period, but then a peak in the middle in which this was due to a relational breakup, but which was worked through during the treatment. And one can see from then on, it's a flat line almost, in which he reports little to no relational difficulties. So there are ways to read these kind of plots if one has sufficient data over a period of time. For some types of treatment, this is, of course, and we're talking about months. For other types of treatment, it might be just a matter of weeks, and also depending on what kind of processes one is working with. These are psychological complex processes, so one cannot expect to see rapid and very stable change. So it needs to be tracked over a long period of time. And then finally working towards writing up the case study, of course, where I think the major challenge I experience is data reduction. One has a lot of data, but at one point one has to comprise it in, let's say, 25, 35 pages, which is generally the length of a case study or paper that is allowed for a journal. So making choices, going to the essence, kill your darlings, as they say, is also very much necessary in qualitative research in general, but also for case studies. So, and then one can submit them to either specialized journals. There are two journals, pragmatic case studies and clinical case studies, who have specific formats on how. So if you want to submit a paper for one of these, look at their instructions because they are very specific. It offers a very good template of how one can do a case study with a different approach in these two journals, but very useful. And then many journals in our field, psychotherapy research, psychotherapy, Journal of Clinical Psychology, but there are many others, are open to publishing case studies. Yeah, it is possible. I mean, getting a scientific paper published is never easy. For case studies, it's not easy either. But still, it's possible if one has been able to condense it. One has some kind of a convincing methodology behind it, and it's perfectly possible. And if one can highlight the relevance also of what one can learn, I think case studies, journals are interested to publish because they know that the readers are also very interested in reading case studies. I also wanted to mention the single case archive here, a single case archive, which is an archive of published case studies. So it's not an archive where you can publish your case study. It's when you have published it somewhere, hopefully it will also be, at one point it will also be mentioned in or included in the case study archive. And you can find other people's case studies there. So it might be interesting to have some templates, some examples from your colleagues. So as a way to conclude, it's a complex type of research, but it's a very rewarding type of research that generates direct, that increases the impact of the models that are there, that are out there, that and that speaks to clinicians because it provides them with an evidence base that is kind of at the right size for them and makes meaning, has some sense for them. I've only been able to touch on parts of the case study research. There's a quite large literature out there. Some of the key references on case study research in the social science, I would definitely like to mention the book edited by Gum, Case Study Methods, which is also quite epistemological, quite fundamental for those who are interested in that kind of questions. Then the book by Robert Yin, which is much more practical. It now also includes a final chapter on case studies in psychology, which is more directly relevant to psychotherapy researchers. Then there's, let's say, classic in the field, the textbook by John McLeod. Then I also want to mention a paper by Greta, one of my former PhD students who now works at Vilnius University, and she has developed a set of quality criteria that case study researchers can use while they are developing their case study project, actually, and what to take into account. So that might be this project of developing quality guidelines is still ongoing, and what will be one of the axes we focus on in the cost action, the European project that Miguel mentioned. And then finally, there are some well-established approaches to doing case study research. As I said, developing a methodology, a bespoke methodology might be quite time-consuming. So you might look at whether you want to do a more narrative clinical case study. I wrote some guidelines on that for psychoanalytic treatment, but I think they're relevant to other approaches too. For pragmatic case studies, which is really about showing how a certain intervention, certain treatment is done with certain types of patients. Then there's a hermeneutical single case efficacy design, which is a whole methodology of kind of quasi-judicial approach to case studies. Because I said it's teamwork, but in this approach, there is a more formal kind of procedure for generating discussion within a team to avoid consensus and to have more open discussion about whether certain hypothesis is confirmed by a case study or whether a certain outcome is, let's say, whether a certain outcome, whether the treatment was effective for a certain patient or not. And then finally, there's the theory building case studies that I mentioned. It's Bob Stiles who published several papers on this methodology and then applied it to develop the assimilation model and to corroborate it with further case studies. So this approach could be used really if you want to develop or refine a certain model through case studies. So a model that is not necessarily focused on the process of a treatment or the outcome of a treatment, can be used for different purposes. So there's that literature. Yeah, thank you for your attention, and I think to come to a conclusion.
Thank you so much,
Ready for
Jochen.
your answer. Yeah.
And I'm sorry for some disruption that we had during the meeting.
I heard, yeah.
Anyway, we went to the end. So we have some time for questions. We are a little bit late, but if you want to use 5 or 10 minutes for questions or comments,
We'll stop the sharing screen.
Yeah, please. Can you do it?
Yeah.
Will the slide be available? There is a question here. If you
Yeah.
agree, we can insert the slides with the presentation at our website, and also with the recording of this presentation, if it's okay. Otherwise, people can see the slides using the presentation. You haven't removed the slides, Jochen.
Okay, I'm trying to.
Don't worry. Don't worry. Don't worry.
I'll find it.
So I don't know if there is any other question. Okay, sorry. Sherwood, you are without sound. Can you activate the sound, please? No, still without sound. We can't hear you.
Maybe
let me try to see if I can. Doesn't work. I am trying to. Can you do it?
Here we go. I think
Okay, now it's working.
I just want to first congratulate Joachim for such a wonderful overview. It's such a difficult area. I have led the Psychoanalytic Research Consortium in the States, in which we've been collecting recorded cases for 35 or 40 years. And every one of the points that you made, I think, are really right to the point and very helpful.
Thanks. Yes, I'm well aware about this consortium has generated some interesting case studies too. Yeah.
Thank you. I could comment further if no one else wants to comment. I'd be interested in, you didn't really talk about the issue of whether you have the actual voices or the transcripts, or whether you have, process notes or much less a full material to work with. And I'd be interested in your comments about that.
I always work with the recordings. Actually, I think it's best to record session. It's really being able to go back to the session is very almost indispensable to do it really rigorously. Also, if it's not only done by the clinician but also by a research team, I think that's particularly interesting. Having the recorder or recording sessions, in my experience, is not let's say a fundamental problem for patients. You get used to it. And patients also get used to it. And I don't have the impression that people speak to the audience or in any sense, or that it kind of becomes part of the process. And so that's why I would definitely recommend to use recordings. Maybe video recording is then yet another, in psychoanalytic therapy, I think it would be difficult. Maybe for other approaches, it's would be more easy to adopt, but that's then more intrusive in my experience.
Well, I've recorded my own work for 40 years now,
Mhm.
And I think that there may be 25,000 recordings, because I've been a clinician the whole time, and I still practice. So I totally confirm what you said. It just disappears into the woodwork. It's really just part of the setting, and patients. The kind of the level of patients that we have, we're working with as outpatients, don't really feel so concerned about the purpose, because it's obvious that we need it as a field, and I think that they generally have a sense of participating in something that's worthwhile.
Yeah.
Thank you. Some other question? Okay, so Joachim, thank you once again for your very nice and clear presentation, and apologize to everybody once again for the technical problems. I hope that they don't repeat in the next webinars. So, and Happy New Year to everybody. Thank you for being here.
And Joachim, let's you and me be in touch, because we have a common interest here, and I'm sure that we can share stuff with you that might be.
Yeah, that would be my pleasure. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Joachim. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Very good.
Thank
Bye.
you very much. Bye.